It's my great pleasure, as I mentioned, to welcome Robert D. Griffiths, who currently serves as the Consul-General for the United States in Shanghai. He's a career Foreign Service officer with overseas postings in Bogota, Colombia, Thailand, Taipei, and then in Shanghai and Beijing on the Chinese mainland. Most recently, he served as a senior course advisor at the Foreign Service Institute in Arlington, Virginia, the MTC for diplomats, as it were. In Washington, he has served as the Bureau of Economic Affairs, as Deputy Director for Mainland Southeast Asia in the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Outside the Department of State, he's worked with the Asia Policy Office in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and served a year in the U.S. Senate in the Office of Senator Harry Reid of Nevada, his home state senator, and as part of the State Department's Pearson program. Fluent in Thai and Chinese, Griffiths received a BA in Asian Studies from Brigham Young University and a master's degree in public policy from Harvard. He and his wife who's here with us, thank you, are the parents of 3 grown children. Today he will be speaking, there's one of 3, that's great. So if you want to ask a lot of really juicy questions, you can go right there after. Today he'll be speaking broadly about his experiences in China, opportunities for studying in China, as well as answering your questions, I'm sure, about careers in diplomacy. So please join me in welcoming Robert Griffiths.
Well, thank you very much for that warm welcome. I had no idea we'd get such a big group here today. Before I get going, though, to make sure that prayers are more efficacious in the future, I probably should share with you my Chinese name so that you can do it completely in Chinese next time. And that is, my Chinese name is Ge Rui Feng. That's Zhuge Liang de Ge, Rui Shi de Rui, and Feng Ge de Feng. So for those of you who are language students, you can start off with that. On the presumption that many of you are of the LDS faith in this group here today, let me just mention a little bit about my experience with that in the Foreign Service. When we joined the Foreign Service, and I say the we here because it's very much a family experience, we knew no other LDS Foreign Service officers. We knew of a couple who had served previously, but we knew of none. And today, to show you how far things have come, in China alone, the Consul-General in Shenyang, the Consul-General in Chengdu, the Consul-General in Shanghai, and the office director, which is essentially a Consul-General in Kaohsiung, Taiwan, are all LDS. And the interesting thing is that none of those 4 was a Chinese-speaking returned missionary. They all served missions in other places. Now, the deputy director, or slightly like the deputy ambassador for Taiwan, next summer will also be LDS. And so, but before you read too much into that, in terms of, what does this really portend? A year, of course, none of them were LDS, and 3 years from now, none of them will be LDS again. So unless you want to read a lot of information into that, you shouldn't read too much information into this, except for the fact how it reflects the fact that more and more LDS families are finding the Foreign Service career to be an attractive career path. Let me just mention a couple of things here quickly about what I think are interesting features of the career for those who might be contemplating joining the service. And then I'd like to spend some time talking about what I actually do as Consul General. And in the course of explaining that, I think we'll touch on a few things about what are going on in U.S.-China relations today. And I'm hoping that that won't take very long, and we can open it up mainly afterwards and focus on your questions. China is such a big place. There is so much going on in so many fields that anything I attempted to talk about would just be hit or miss in terms of what your interests are. So we'll look forward to your questions. Be thinking of them now, and we'll get to that shortly. Okay, the Foreign Service as a career has a lot of implications for family life that go well beyond what normally you would have to be thinking about. A lot of that is kind of obvious. You live overseas. Now, the first question that might arise is, well, what does this mean for family ties? You know, a lot of people here in Provo, they have big families, they grow up, the kids all live within, you know, a mile radius, they get together for, you know, Sunday dinner every night. What happens to that if you join the Foreign Service? Well, you don't get that anymore when you join the Foreign Service. However, unlike when we first joined, when we just had to write letters, anybody know what a letter is? Well, anyway. But now things are, we have a Utah 801 phone number, and we can dial it from overseas, and it's just like being here. There's Skype, obviously, and we played the game of life, you know, that board game. We played it on Skype with our son and his family, you know, from China, or maybe we were in Thailand at that point. But it's really a lot easier to stay close to your family now than ever was before. It's simply a matter of technology. But even more than that, when we were posted in Washington, it was kind of expensive to get the whole family back out west to see our family and that. But when we were overseas, well, they paid for us to go home. And so we would spend a month or so every summer with my mom and our other relatives. And that was a lot more time than a lot of people who were able to spend with their relatives. So I feel like we really didn't lose out very much in terms of connection with relatives, though you did not have that regular Sunday evening meal together, if that's what, you know, what the substance of your family relations is. You don't get that, but it really isn't that bad. In different parts of the country, depending on where you are, public education might be good, might not be so good. When you're overseas, the education of your children is well provided for. In many places overseas, certainly in the big cities of China and all over Asia, which is with what I'm most familiar, you basically get a private school education. The international schools are just outstanding, sometimes over the top. You know, when my son was in 9th grade and he had to play the neighboring school in a soccer match, well, the neighboring school when we were in Shanghai was in Osaka, Japan. So that, you know, the 9th graders all get on a plane and fly to Japan and play their games. And of course, the experiences that you have in these sorts of settings are a little bit different than what you might get driving down to Payson or when my son went on this particular trip to Osaka, he got together with a couple of guys and they got on a bus to go shopping at a mall, but he sort of lost them at the mall. And then he realized that he didn't know what bus to get on to go back. And so here's his 9th grade kid, spoke not a lick of Japanese, stuck somewhere in Osaka, and what to do? Well, he knelt down and prayed is what he did, and he got an answer. But before I get to that, while of course he was hanging out with his high school buds, you know, from Shanghai, they were of course, you know, bragging about, you know, what girls they could pick up and how Japanese girls are cute and all this sort of stuff. Of course, none of them had any capability of attracting any of them. but my brother, my son, not my brother, after he had said his prayer and had, you know, done what he felt he could do in terms of trying to communicate, he finally attracted the attention of a couple of co-eds who spoke some English and helped him and actually accompanied him as Japanese who are just super friendly and helpful when they really, you know, realize there's a need. Accompanied him all the way back. And not only got him on the right bus, but went with him on the bus, not only got off the bus, but accompanied him into the place where they were staying. And so here are all his friends hanging out there, and my son shows up with these two good-looking co-eds bringing him back. And he thought it was pretty cool. But so you have a, you know, life provides lots of experiences, and I'm not going to try and claim that, you know, living overseas you're going to become a more celestial being than you did if you spent your entire life in Springville. I don't know that. But it is kind of fun to go abroad and have different experiences, and it's something that's, you know, kind of appealing to a lot of people. Not appealing to everybody, and that's fine. But You might wonder about church. Well, when we first moved to Shanghai in 1997, we went to church our first Sunday, and it was, we found another member, and we sat in a little circle in their living room, and there were 10 or 12 of us, and we just had one little lesson, and, did that. Today, when we went back to Shanghai in just last August, and there were 2 huge branches, would be wards if there was a stake, and they meet in this convention center ballroom kind of place, and have the full program of the church there, and it's just amazing, and I think it's a great church experience to have. And you get people coming through all the time. You get a lot of people from BYU coming through. I was serving as branch president earlier in Shanghai, and we would have people come over and have dinner at our home. And my children got exposed to a lot of people who they probably wouldn't have been exposed to otherwise on an intimate basis. So I think it's kind of cool. I promote the career, and yeah, let me just say a couple of things. What does it take to get into this career? Those of you who have looked into it, it's very straightforward. There is a written test that is administered once or twice a year. You go online, you apply for it. If you pass that, you go through another series of things. The main one is an oral assessment, which is an oral test that bring you in, and you'll sit in with other aspiring diplomats, be grilled by a team of professional State Department grillers, and they'll ask you about lots of stuff. And it's a basic liberal arts kind of thing. You got to know something about politics, about history, about economics. Not deep knowledge in most cases, but the more you know, the better. And so if you're interested in international affairs, if you read, if you pay attention to what's going on, you're probably going to find that you're fairly well prepared for the exam. And if you take it and don't do well, at least now you know what's on the exam. And of course, there are practice exams nowadays and study groups online and all the sort of stuff that we never had. We just were expected to pass the test right off the bat. Imagine that. So, but it's doable. It's doable. Okay, well, we can revisit some of those issues later if you like, and I would certainly be happy if you'd like to hear the perspective of a child who grew up in the Foreign Service and a spouse who endured the experience as well and is still enduring it. But let me move on and talk a little bit about life as Consul General. Let me start off by doing a little work in nomenclature, in what things are called. When the United States has a representation from its government to a foreign government and posts that overseas, they send an ambassador who sets up an embassy. And in the early days, the embassy was the residence of the ambassador. That was the embassy. And the embassy spoke to the organization and the physical presence there. Led in the diplomatic team was led by an ambassador. As these missions began to grow and take on more responsibilities, they would set up a separate office building, which was called the Chancery. So you had an embassy and a chancery. Those two names have been completely garbled over time, and now the office building is usually referred to as the embassy, and the ambassador's residence is just called the residence. And since no work goes on anymore, nobody really cares. So, now in addition to that, which is always in the capital, you have basically branch offices of the embassy, and those are called consulates. And for reasons that aren't clear to anybody, bigger ones could be called a Consulate General as opposed to a mere consulate. And Consulates General are headed by Consuls General as opposed to mere consuls. There may be some size criteria that you graduate from one to the other, but I don't think so. When we were establishing our diplomatic relations with the Chinese back in the very late 1970s, they felt like Consulate General sounded more important than consulate, and so they wanted all of their consulates in the United States to be Consulates General. And we said, okay, and so all of our consulates in China are Consulates General. So now that you've got that, now let me confuse it. Originally, when these branch offices were set up, they were normally set up in ports. And they normally, their task was to take care of seamen who were visiting on ships. And they would do what's called consular work. And then they began to get more in terms of trade and deal with business disputes, help out foreign citizens, and issue visas to foreigners who want to travel to the United States. These are all consular activities. So that's why they're called consulates. In an embassy, you have one part of the embassy that's called the consular section, as opposed to the economic section or the political section. And the consular section in an embassy does all this consular work. Well, the head of that section, unlike the other heads, which would be the head of the political section or the head of the economic section, they are not called the head of the consular section, they are called Consuls General. So you immediately see the confusion. So if you're a Consul General, you could either be working in an embassy as the head of the consular section or head of one of these branch offices that is around the country, which is what I am now. Now, to confuse it a little bit further, in my role as a Consul General in a Consulate General, which is around the country, I actually have no authority whatsoever to do consular work. I can't issue a visa. I'm not allowed to. And if I even tried to get involved in that, I could be in serious ethical trouble. Because to issue visas, which is the bulk of most consular work, you have to have a consular commission. And you get that commission by undergoing special training in Washington, D.C. before you go out and serve as a consular officer. And I did that many years ago, but my commission has expired, and so I can't do visas anymore. So, is that clear? What I am actually is basically the head of a branch office, of an office that is fairly large, and we basically do all the functions of an embassy. And in Shanghai, we have about 270 people who work in the consulate, and about 75 of them are Americans, and the rest of them are local Chinese. So it's a pretty big operation, and we do everything that, most everything that an embassy would do, we do just on a smaller, more localized scale. We have a hunk of China that is our responsibility. It's 3 provinces of Zhejiang, Jiangsu, and Anhui, in addition to the municipality of Shanghai. And we're responsible for reporting and providing visa services, taking care of American citizens in that whole region. About roughly 200 million people, 2/3 the size of the United States in our little consulate region there. So, what is it I do? Well, what most people see me do is drive around town in this stretch black Cadillac with a flag flying on the front, and they think that's really cool. I would love to have that job. And it is kind of fun, but it's a bulletproof vehicle, and it's really heavy, and you can't roll down the windows because they don't roll down. And even opening it, you develop a lot of upper body strength by just getting in and out of the car. Okay, so I go around in town in this big car. What do I do? Well, let me mention, I think, 5 things here I've made note of. And first of all is I receive visitors. We receive lots of visitors. And it's kind of fun to receive visitors in the consulate in Shanghai. When the Chinese opened up Shanghai, and they knew that this was back in the early 80s, lots of foreign countries wanted to have representation there. And basically they went around and found all these old French colonial mansions that had long since been taken over by the government and all that. And they sort of gave them all to these foreign consulates to be their consulate. And we got one of the really nice ones, and it's really a beautiful 5-acre plot right in the middle of Shanghai. We have a big garden, we have fruit trees, we had a carriage house, we have a little fountain in the lake in the back. The mansion itself is all this old carved wood all over the place and high ceilings, well decorated and all that. It's the kind of place that people think diplomats actually live in. And we do. We don't live there, but that's where we work. It's completely dysfunctional as an office building, but it's so cool to be there that we hang on to it, and it's really fun to receive visitors there. And we have several different, we can bring them into our library or we put up the Constitution one, so it's the Constitution room or our representational areas. And it's really cool. But so I receive a lot of visitors. Sometimes they are high-level American government officials from various departments. Sometimes they are heads or near heads of big global companies. I've talked to Nike and Boeing and Procter & Gamble and a lot of these guys. And they're all coming to Shanghai to find out from the Consul General what is going on here. And to usually pitch for something that they're hoping we can help them out with. But anyway, so it's kind of fun to talk to all these people who you'd never get to talk to in normal life. And we also receive cultural groups and theatrical groups, and we do receptions for them, and we have them perform for us sometimes, and it's kind of fun. And we also get, maybe of interest to you, university people, university presidents. I've had both for your information, BYU has a lot of programs going on in China, but they are by no means at the leader of the pack. There are US universities that are building campuses in Shanghai that are exactly like their campuses in the United States. And they will be issuing the same degrees that they issue in the United States. Two of them in particular right now are New York University and Duke are building actual campuses there. There are other universities that have near campus kinds of programs going on. And it's a happening place when it comes to advanced education. And the Chinese are very welcoming and very anxious to get the best education they can get available to their people. But it's largely an international student body as well. It's not just Chinese, because the language of instruction is English. And so, in addition to all the many wonderful ways to go over there and learn Chinese, people are now going to Shanghai to get American educational degrees in English. Kind of interesting. Another thing I do, in addition to welcoming people, is to interact with the other consuls general. And there are about 60 or 70 other countries who have consulates general in Shanghai, and we get together. Now, this interaction is really not terribly important from how I spend my time. But it is the stuff of most diplomatic and spy movies. And this is where the whole image of the whispered conversations at cocktail parties come from, you know. And it's the other, you know, what have you heard, you know, what have you heard? And this is all the consuls general who are getting together at these receptions to trade information and all that. Not much happens in that realm anymore. It's much easier to get information. All of us have direct access to Chinese officialdom, but it's kind of fun to get their perspectives on things. And they have very different perspectives sometimes. So I interact with those folks as well. Other big area that I work on is overseeing our reporting to Washington. If you're an economic or political officer in the Foreign Service, much of your life is very much like an investigative reporter. You go out and find out what's going on. These are not spies, okay? These are just regular officers. They do everything above ground. They talk to professors who are specializing in studying something. They talk to government officials. They talk to whoever they need to talk to and whoever will talk to them to get the story right and be able to inform Washington about what's really going on in at least that part of China with regard to a whole host of economic and political, social issues. One of the big growth areas in reporting now is an area, we call it ESTH, that stands for Environment, Science, Technology, and Health. And the interactive programs, the cooperation that we have going on with China at so many levels is more than we can ever keep track of. Even just in our part of China, we cannot even keep track of all the exchange programs that are going on between the US government and the US companies, and all that in these realms. There's a tremendous amount of work going on. But we report on that kind of stuff too. Next, and this is what I probably spend most of my time doing and working on, is outreach. As I mentioned, we have this just 200 million little clump of China that we're responsible for. And I travel and I go out and talk to people and visit the officials, visit universities. I promote US exports. I promote Chinese investment into the United States so that when your house prices are falling in Provo, we will get some Chinese people to come in here and buy them so that they'll keep the prices up and you can get what you want. That doesn't excite everybody, but our preference is that they would buy companies that would employ a lot of people and reduce our joblessness rate. But anyway, we're promoting investment. And if that seems a little odd that, oh, we're going to sell out our country, you know, well, what's going on here, you know? And well, keep in mind that that's exactly what we've been doing in China for decades, pouring tons of money in there. Why? Because it made business sense. It was, in many cases, a cheap manufacturing platform. They were trying to get closer to their markets in Asia. It just made business sense. Well, because of the growth of the Chinese economy and its size in the world, the kinds of business activities they're now involved in, the current state of the US economy, there are a lot of good deals here. And it just makes business sense that you'd now get some of the Chinese wealth coming to the United States. The United States actually has traditionally always been the largest source of foreign investment in the world, even greater than China. We just don't notice it too much because it comes in at the private level. It doesn't go through government channels. As most everything in China does, the government keeps track of all that. They can tell you exactly how much money came in. We don't really have a mechanism to do that very well. Anyway, so I push investment. I visit universities. In Nanjing University, I was there a month or two ago. They're doing kind of a cool thing. They have identified the house, which still exists there on campus, where Pearl Buck lived when she wrote all of her famous novels. And not where she grew up, that's another place, but where she actually lived. And, you know, this is an American woman, missionary family, living in China many years ago. And they, with their own resources, are restoring the house to be a historical museum. And going to great lengths. They are taking it very seriously and making it exactly the way it was back then. It was a brick structure. They had stuccoed it around to make it pretty in later years. They've taken all the stuccoing off to reveal the bricks, because that's the way it was when Mrs. Buck lived there. And the whole interior, they're recreating it the way that it was when she was there. These are the Chinese. The Chinese are doing it with Chinese money, and yet it is something that will reflect the ties that China has with the United States, and that's kind of cool. I also visited, on another trip, a Plasma Physics Institute in Hefei. They are doing pretty advanced stuff in terms of trying to develop nuclear fusion technology. Now, this, maybe you are aware of this, there's a Utah connection here. Many years ago, there was a cold fusion discovery that took place at the University of Utah that was touted and then didn't pan out quite as they hoped to, and everybody sort of lost face. But there was, about when I was an undergraduate here, back in the Dark Ages, there was a new line of research going in for nuclear fusion. The predominant research at that time involved laser beams shooting in on a little molecule to try and get it to work. And this new idea was called magnetic containment, where you create a force field that would force the molecules or atoms or whatever those little things are together. I'm not a science major. That was going on at BYU, and it was sort of cutting edge at its time. And over the decades since then, it has become the technology of choice in trying to develop nuclear fusion. And this Plasma Research Institute has the largest and most successful magnetic containment facility in the world now. But it's not just a Chinese thing. It is an extremely collaborative thing. There are foreign scientists, mostly from the United States, coming there to do experiments all the time. And all the data that is derived from these experiments is published in academic journals for everybody to use. It's just a wonderful example of scientific collaboration and cooperation. While I'm at the university, I also push student exchanges. I visited the flagship program at BYU, that BYU is sort of the lead on at Nanjing University, and that was a wonderful experience for me. In addition to the outreach to the universities and officials, I'm going quickly here, I'm running out of time. I visited other interesting places. I visited a Chinese company that is a private company that has existed for over 40 years. It was a private company that started out as a bicycle repair shop. And the guy who started that bicycle repair shop is now the president of it. And it survived all the way through the Cultural Revolution and everything as a private company, and now is huge. And it has, of late, taken to buying up auto parts companies in the Rust Belt of the United States that were on the verge of going bankrupt, infusing capital into them, negotiating deals with the labor unions, which was a real challenge for them, and turned them around to profit-making enterprises and saved all those jobs. That was a Chinese company. It's done it in a dozen different companies in the United States. Kind of interesting. I also visited an orphanage, and many of you might find interesting that in this orphanage, it started out years ago where basically they took in all the orphans, put them up in dormitory-style accommodations, and then they thought, you know, this really isn't a good environment for these kids to grow up in dorms. The same realization that the United States came to many decades ago when they got rid of orphanages for that purpose. And they thought, you know, there are a lot of single women out there. Maybe they could come in and sort of almost like a big sister program that we'd be familiar with here, sort of be a surrogate mom to these kids. And that program went, and then that went on for a few years, and then this orphanage realized, you know, that just still isn't really good enough. They really need a family setting. And so now they build apartments rather than dorms, and they screen carefully couples who are usually empty nesters who are willing to make multi-year, decade-long commitments to come in and be parents to orphans. And they will sign 4 orphans of different ages to create a family. And the husband is expected to continue to go to work every day, and the mother is expected to be a full-time mom and be at home and take care of the kids. Wow, what an idea. And the Chinese came with this all on their own, and they're particularly proud of it because think about it, in most Chinese families today, there's only one kid who is getting spoiled rotten, and they all know it, and they don't know what to do about it. And this orphanage is very proud that they have 4 kids in a family, so they have to learn how to get along, how to share, and they will make better citizens than people outside the orphanage. That's kind of cool. All right, moving very quickly. In addition to doing outreach in conjunction with that, I give lots of speeches, most of which I'm aware of before they invite me to the podium, but not always. I try to give as much as I can in Chinese, but if it's sometimes too unprepared, I have an interpreter who will work with me. And to be honest, sometimes people enjoy hearing their language from a native speaker rather than garbled by a foreigner, even who is trying hard. But I also have speeches that I have practiced well, that I really think people can understand, and more lengthy, more substantive, and I give these to student groups at universities, and then we do a Q&A afterwards. And I think it's really helpful for them to see that US government officials are accessible. They will answer your questions. They will speak to you relatively frankly. And that's a lot of fun. I like that as much as anything else. And then the last thing I do as Consul General is manage the consulate. And it's a different experience to, I mean, my whole career I've been doing things. I've been writing the reports. I've been, taking on the projects. I've been taking care of the visitors. And now I don't do any of that anymore. I have to create an environment where others can do that successfully. And that's a different challenge for me, but I'm working on it. But so that's fun. So I have to spend a certain amount of time building morale, keeping morale high, keeping people wanting to come to work and be happy every day. And so we do morale building things. Okay, let me open it up for questions here after I make just a couple of very tiny observations. China is the happening place right now. It is the golden age of Chinese economic development right now. Everybody in the world wants to be there. Everybody in the world wants to be friendly with China. Everybody in the world sees tremendous advantages to being on good terms with China and taking advantage of mutual opportunities, and that includes the United States. At the same time, of course, there are challenges involved with China's rise. But there's no question in my mind that those challenges have to be managed, not choked off, because there is just too much going on there, and we would not want to not be part of it. Okay, I'm ready for questions. Yes?
Could you describe sort of the entry-level positions as a foreign service in the foreign service, and about what those were, and then how long until you kind of graduate from that?
The Foreign Service has 5 cones or specialties. Why they call them cones, I have no idea, but 5 specialties. They are management, consular, public affairs, economic, and political. And when you are accepted into the Foreign Service, you will be allocated one of those specialties, and that will be your specialty. Almost all officers, however, regardless of their specialty, will serve their first or second tours doing consular work, because there is such a tremendous demand for visa issuance around the world. And so typically, and those first 2 assignments are only 2 years long, and then if you successfully complete those, you will be tenured, and then you really have to screw up to get kicked out after that. And not unlike university, but and so that's what they do. Now, let me hasten to add that even if you're in one of these specialties, it doesn't mean you can never do anything else. You can. But normally, you'll be spending most of your time doing that kind of thing. Other questions? Yes?
Have you seen a dramatic difference in how the Chinese view intellectual property over the last decade or so?
Not dramatic enough. But it's improving. Typical of any developing country, including the United States back 100 years ago, if it's somebody else's intellectual property and will help you get rich, it's worth stealing. And that's what they do. And China is bad that way. It is getting better. And it's getting better for obvious reasons, because they're now developing their own intellectual property, and they realize they need to protect that as well. And they have courts, and they have law enforcement improvements. It's not happening well, and not happening fast enough for us, but it is improving, and will continue to improve. Yes?
Can you hear a little bit from your wife and kids about what it's like to be family members of someone in foreign service?
Okay, 2 minutes, go.
Okay, let's see, where do I start? I love living overseas. It's been great. In fact, Robert wanted to retire, and I said, sorry, I'm not ready yet. Gotta find another job because I really like living overseas. It's a great education. I've learned more about the world, and I think it's been a great experience raising a family overseas. Now, part of the reason for that is because Robert's been very careful about making sure that every ongoing tour, because we move every 3 years, that it would be good for the family. So we'd make sure that the schools were good, that it would, that we've always looked to have a church presence there, so that our kids would have a strong church experience. And we have 3 really awesome kids, and the church has always been where we've been overseas, and it's been a wonderful, wonderful experience. We just celebrated my birthday yesterday and had 70 people show up, from people that we've known all over the world who just happened to be back here, either moved back or here for the holidays. And it's just been a wonderful opportunity. But I think because we've managed it well, because we know a lot of people overseas who really shouldn't be there, especially where the husband says, a tradition where the husband says, I want to be overseas, and the husband says, oh, I love my husband, okay, I'll go overseas, but I don't really like this. And they shouldn't be there. And so for those who want to be overseas, marry the right person. Because that will make a tremendous difference in the whole family experience that you have overseas, and you enjoy doing that as a family. And it's been a very positive experience, and I would gladly do it over again.
Chelsea?
I also really love living overseas and growing up. We did move every 3 years, and so there were challenges with that, you know, like making new friends every 3 years. It usually took about a year to get acclimated to a place and to make friends and to feel comfortable. But by the end of your 3-year tour, you had lots of friends and everything. We really learned how to be friendly, how to talk to people of all ages, of all cultural backgrounds. But I think the biggest thing is you need a level, or especially with kids growing up, you need some sort of consistency. And since the place and location of school was always constantly changing, the consistency came from our family. And so like having a really strong family life is really important when moving overseas. And I think that's what grounded us throughout moving and why we had such good experience.
Thank you. Let me add just a couple of things. We have tried and been quite successful at managing our career what was good for the family. It isn't always possible. When you join the Foreign Service, you are worldwide available. You can be assigned anywhere on any assignment. And now there is an expectation that most officers will serve an unaccompanied assignment for at least 1 year. And so it's a little more challenging than that, but clearly, you know, you have a lot more influence than you might think in terms of where you go. And also I should add that there are a lot of women Foreign Service officers now, including LDS. And we know some who they have trailing spouses and who do very well. They have a skill set, they can get jobs or not, and do lots of things. There's lots of things to do normally when you're overseas. Yes?
So for those that might be, interested in entering Foreign Service, is there any kind of advice you give based on like the programs that we have these days that weren't available before? Is there any advice you can give us on that?
I would advise you to talk to the Foreign Service Officer Association. What are they called here?
Student Association.
Yeah, right here on campus, and they know all about that. They really do. More than I do, actually, because it's changed a lot in the decades since I took the test. But they can tell you best way to prepare. Yeah. Yes?
I know this isn't your, area, this isn't what your job is, but I was just wondering, is China aware of the LDS Church? I mean, they have so many people working for them, like what do they think of the church? Do you think that's maybe helping maybe missionaries get there someday?
It's an interesting question. China has been forced to acknowledge that there's an LDS faith. When I say forced, they have really done a lot of work to resuscitate, after the Cultural Revolutions, the existing religions in China. And their 5 main religions: Taoism, Buddhism, Catholicism, Protestantism, and Islam. And the LDS Church is a headache for them because we didn't pre-exist, so they don't really know in what group to lump us. And yet they certainly realize that we're a force in the world. Ambassador Huntsman was LDS. Now they've got all these Consuls-General running around. We got them running for president now, you know, and they can't ignore us. And so they're accommodating us. President Hinckley said way back, he said, when we go into China, we will go through the front door, we will not go through the back door. And that is really significant because we are probably the only foreign religion that is doing that. So many other American Christian faiths are selling Bibles underground and running underground missionary programs and stuff like that. And we're not. And very slowly, we have begun to gain the respect of the Chinese authorities so that they can allow us to do the bare minimum of what we need. You know, we're not allowed to build chapels, we're certainly not allowed to do missionary work, but we can do what we have to do. And then we're developing a bit of trust. Missionaries going there, not on the foreseeable horizon. You know, I don't want to say never. I mean, who knows what will happen someday, but not on the foreseeable horizon. And but things are happening. There are many Chinese citizens who join the church overseas, go back to China, and they're meeting, and the Chinese government is well aware of that. And we don't talk about that much because we don't want it to become a high-profile issue that they would then have to deal with some way. But very slowly but surely, the church is becoming more comfortable for the Chinese. I think we have time for one more question, maybe? Yes?
I spent the last semester in Nanjing. It was really interesting over there, both from the side of the students who were with me and also from my Chinese friends, to see the internet and how it worked over there. Is that something that the Chinese government is still struggling to deal with and making steps towards a more open internet, or are they kind of going in the direction? Have you seen anything like that?
Well, it's interesting. In being here at BYU, you probably have a better feel for it than most other Americans do. Here on the BYU campus, you are protected from a lot of the evil influences in the world. And you know, and there are certain kinds of speakers that will not be speaking here on campus. There are certain organizations that will not be setting up here on campus. There are certain fashions that will not be displayed here on campus. And in its best light, the Chinese are trying to do that same thing for their entire country, and to keep out bad influences. The problem is the list of bad influences they have is quite a bit longer than what we have even here. And it certainly includes things that we think are quite important: political freedoms, human rights, stuff like that. And so they are wrestling mightily with how to keep things under control. And we constantly pressure them to open up more. It's also true that they have a genuine fear of confusion and chaos because of their history that we probably don't instinctively recognize and appreciate. And they really are trying, from their perspective, they're keeping this lid on this boiling pot, and if they don't do it properly, they're in big trouble. And we think, you know, why can't people look on Facebook, for crying out loud? You know, what's the big deal? You know, but they see Facebook as a tool to bring, you know, protesters to Tahrir Square in Cairo. That's what they see Facebook as being. So you can't get Facebook in China without, you know, going through little portals and stuff. They know they're not going to cut it off completely, but that's okay. As long as they can keep control, then that's what their goal is. And it's a challenge for them. It's a particular challenge in the universities. It's a challenge for all the American universities who are trying to set up in China. But, you know, those things are all negotiated. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate your interest in it, and we'll be here for a bit if you want to keep talking, and go enjoy the rest of your day.